She stood beside her husband with every camera watching. But after Jasmine Crockett unsealed her marriage file, 24 seconds later, Melania Trump couldn't finish her sentence. There was barely a dozen people left in the chamber when it happened. A gray Wednesday night had stretched into early Thursday. C-SPAN had cut to a wide shot. Staffers were yawning. The few journalists still awake had half-written drafts open, thinking the hearing was winding down. Then Jasmine Crockett said 4 words no one was expecting. "I move to unseal." No one even looked up at first. Not until she repeated herself, louder this time, sliding a folder across the desk toward the committee clerk. The camera zoomed in slowly. Someone in the background whispered, "She's serious." Chairwoman Lynn Caro frowned, clearly blindsided. "This document," Jasmine said, steady and slow, "relates to a sealed civil filing submitted in 2021. It involves a request for post-nuptial modification by Mrs. Melania Trump while her husband was President of the United States." Now people looked up. You could almost hear the click of keyboards resuming, phones lighting up, heads turning. This wasn't budget amendments or infrastructure funding. This was personal, presidential personal. A man from the back of the room, New Hampshire Representative Declan Foster, started to object, but Jasmine was already reading. The petitioner, Melania Trump, respectfully requests amendment of the post-nuptial agreement, specifically regarding asset protection tied to overseas holdings and personal estate planning. The request stems from an ongoing concern about liability stemming from her husband's political, business, and personal affairs. You could see it, how the room shifted. Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it. She wasn't grandstanding. She was walking people through something that, on paper, looked dry, legal filings, estate protections, but the subtext was louder than anything she was saying. Melania had tried to redraw the lines of her marriage while Trump was still in the White House, and now the public knew. The document was unsealed, legally. Jasmine hadn't leaked anything. She'd followed a rarely used rule that allowed disclosure of sealed material if tied directly to a current ethics investigation. And that's exactly what this was. Just 72 hours earlier, the Ethics Committee had launched a formal probe into undisclosed foreign interests connected to the Trump family, specifically property in Slovenia and Dubai that hadn't been reported on mandatory financial disclosures. Nobody expected Jasmine to connect Melania's postnup to it, but she did, and she knew exactly how long to pause before reading again. The next section detailed private meetings Melania had arranged with independent counsel in Reno, Nevada. The filings mentioned concern over being held financially liable for activities of which she had no involvement or knowledge, and, more damningly, a fear of exposure stemming from her husband's disregard for legal formalities. That line would appear in headlines the next day. Even the chair had trouble hiding her expression, but Jasmine just kept reading, not fast, not slow, just enough for every word to hit. Reporters in the room began whispering into phones. An aide passed a note to the chair. Someone on Twitter live transcribed a sentence and hit send. Then, without warning, the committee feed went national. CNN cut to live coverage. MSNBC followed. A producer at Fox, unsure what was happening but sensing momentum, threw up a chyron. Breaking, Melania Trump postnup unsealed, live on House floor. Thousands watched, then millions. Meanwhile, across town, inside the East Room of the White House, Melania Trump sat beside her husband during a scheduled press event about agricultural subsidies. The mood had been controlled. The president was doing most of the talking. Melania had only prepared a few lines. That's when a reporter shouted out, "Madam First Lady, care to comment on the newly unsealed court filing?" She blinked, then blinked again. You could see it happening in real time, her fingers pressing a small note card tighter. She began reading her statement, but stumbled over the second sentence. Started again, mispronounced a word, then went quiet. People noticed. She leaned in toward the microphone again, but this time she just whispered, "No comment," and stepped away from the podium. It took 24 seconds from the moment the reporter asked until she left the stage. Those 24 seconds would be replayed on news loops for days. But the real story wasn't just in her silence. It was in who made her go silent in the first place. The clip of Melania Trump hesitating, stumbling, then walking off didn't just go viral, it exploded. News outlets cut it into pieces, zoomed in on her eyes, her hands, even the slight shake in her voice. It aired on every major channel that night, followed by expert panels and body language analysts scrambling to decode what it meant. But behind those 24 seconds was something more human, more complicated. She hadn't prepared for this. That day had been routine. She'd spent the morning in a closed-door meeting with the president and a team of agricultural lobbyists, then sat for makeup and wardrobe just like any other event. She'd been briefed about drought relief efforts and given a simple message to deliver: hope, resilience, unity. No one said anything about Jasmine Crockett or an unsealed document. Melania hadn't even looked at her phone since early afternoon. So when the reporter's voice cut across the room, she was caught between instinct and protocol. She couldn't lie. Not directly, not when the cameras were that close. But saying nothing would only fuel speculation. Her staff tried to intervene, but she'd already stepped down. She walked straight through the double doors, past two Secret Service agents who exchanged worried looks. One of them radioed someone immediately. Inside the press room, the energy flipped. Journalists knew they had something big. They weren't just reporting on a document anymore. They were watching a reaction. A very human, very real reaction from the First Lady of the United States. And just like that, the tone of the story changed. Now it wasn't about a line in a filing. It was about what Melania wasn't saying. Back in the committee room, Jasmine Crockett didn't smile. She didn't throw punches or deliver any rehearsed zingers. She simply closed the folder, looked at the chair, and asked, "May this be entered into the public record?" There was a beat of silence before the chair responded. "So moved." That was it. C-SPAN cut the feed a minute later. The room emptied quickly. But outside, on Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, thousands of clips were already circulating. Hashtags popped up. Post-Nup 2021, Melania walks off, Crockett unsealed. One video, taken from someone watching the committee stream on their phone at a diner in Eugene, Oregon, caught the moment a server gasped and whispered, "She's got guts." Jasmine's office, meanwhile, was a blur of movement. Staffers worked phones nonstop. Requests for interviews poured in. CNN wanted her live within the hour. MSNBC booked her for the next morning. Even international outlets, Germany's ZDF, France 24, were asking for statements. But Jasmine stayed put. She refused every offer that night. Instead, she went home to her two-bedroom condo in Arlington, heated up leftover pasta, and sat on the edge of her couch with her shoes still on. Her phone vibrated constantly. She finally answered one call, from her mother in Dallas. "You okay, baby?" her mom asked softly. "I'm fine, Mama," Jasmine replied, tired but certain. Her mom hesitated. "They're gonna come for you now." "I know," Jasmine said, "but I didn't lie." Across town, the West Wing was in damage control mode. Staffers scrambled to draft statements. Trump himself was furious, not just at Jasmine, but at whoever let that filing get unsealed in the first place. "Get the damn lawyer who approved that," he yelled in a closed-door meeting. Melania, meanwhile, was quiet. She didn't attend dinner. She didn't return calls. She went straight to the private residence and requested to be left alone. According to someone close to the family, she took a long bath, changed into one of her old robes from her New York apartment, and sat by the window for nearly 2 hours without saying a word. She knew this wasn't going to go away. The following morning, every major newspaper ran variations of the same headline. First Lady's legal move during presidency revealed, Crockett forces public reckoning. And in smaller subheads, words like independence, autonomy, and self-protection appeared again and again. For the first time in a long while, people weren't focused on Melania Trump as a fashion figure or silent partner. They were asking real questions. Why had she filed the request? What was she trying to shield herself from? And why did it take someone like Jasmine Crockett to bring it to light? But while the nation argued about what Melania's silence meant, Jasmine knew the fight had just begun. 3 weeks earlier, Jasmine Crockett sat across from her chief counsel, arms crossed, tired eyes fixed on a single line in a redacted ethics report. It wasn't the kind of document that screamed headlines. It was buried in Appendix D, mixed into a bland audit of financial disclosures tied to the Trump Family Foundation. But Jasmine noticed something others had skipped. A reference to an offshore account reassignment dated May 2021. One tied not to Donald Trump, but to Melania. That was odd. Even odder was that it coincided with a string of sealed civil filings in Nevada, unusual jurisdiction for someone residing in D.C. It took her team another 9 days to connect the dots. When they did, it all pointed to one document, a private petition filed by Melania Trump to renegotiate the couple's post-nuptial terms. Not to dissolve the marriage, but to isolate herself from Trump's international property liabilities. Jasmine had sat quietly with the knowledge for almost a full day. She knew what it looked like. A political stunt, a personal attack. But this wasn't about scandal for scandal's sake. Not to her. She kept thinking of the broader implications. If the First Lady of the United States, still in office at the time, had taken secret legal steps to shield herself from her husband's holdings, what did that say about the ethical state of the executive branch? It's not about the marriage, she told her team during a closed-door prep session. It's about the influence, the power, the fear. There were risks, of course, big ones. She'd be accused of attacking a woman, of prying into a marriage, of being opportunistic. She could almost hear the Fox News panel already, framing her as angry, reckless, or worse. They'd go after her appearance, her tone, her district. It always circled back to the same tired playbook. But this felt different. This was a woman saying she didn't want to go down with the ship. And Jasmine believed that mattered. Her staff was split. One aide, a 26-year-old legislative fellow from Spokane, said, "This'll blow up everything, even if you're right." But another, a policy analyst who'd worked for the Obama ethics team, said, "If you're going to do it, now's the time. You might only get one shot like this." So she called a friend in Reno, a quiet, sharp attorney who owed her a favor from back when she was still doing civil rights work in Texas. The lawyer confirmed it. Melania had filed. It had been sealed immediately, but he'd seen the docket number. It was real. The next step was legal. Jasmine couldn't leak it. Wouldn't. That wasn't how she worked. But there was a mechanism buried in a House ethics sub-rule that allowed sealed material to be presented if it directly tied to a current government ethics inquiry. It had to be done in session, on the record, publicly. So she waited. She watched as the ethics committee hearings dragged on with the usual fluff: foreign investment tracking, shell company loopholes, asset reporting compliance. Most of it was dry, procedural. No one paid attention, not until she spoke up. And the moment she said the words, "I move to unseal," she knew there was no turning back. Now, less than 24 hours later, her office had already fielded over 200 media requests. Her name was trending on every platform. Supporters hailed her as brave. Critics slammed her as calculated. But Jasmine had spent too long in this system to care about likes or retweets. She wanted to talk about power, about how women, even at the top, were sometimes boxed into legal corners just to breathe freely. She hadn't grown up in political circles. She came from South Dallas. Public schools, long shifts at her mom's salon, volunteer work in overcrowded courthouses. She remembered what it felt like to watch powerful people slide past consequences just because they had a last name or a title. Melania Trump, in her view, was different. She wasn't trying to win an election. She wasn't trying to rewrite history. She was trying to protect herself, quietly, discreetly. And no one would have known if Jasmine hadn't pulled the thread. But now that the thread had unraveled, Jasmine knew the next move wouldn't be hers. It would come from behind the gates of the White House. By sunrise, things inside the West Wing were already unraveling. Chief of Staff Bradley Knorr, one of the few who had stuck around since the early campaign days, was pacing outside the Situation Room, phone pressed to his ear, barking at whoever was on the other end. Every 5 minutes, a different aide brought in a new printout. Tweets, headlines, transcripts, screenshots of cable news, lower thirds. They were all variations of the same message. The First Lady tried to protect herself from the president. Behind closed doors, Donald Trump was furious, not surprised, just angry. According to a staffer who leaked details to a journalist later that afternoon, he shouted for nearly 30 minutes. Not about the filing itself, he'd known about that for a while, but about the timing, the exposure, the fact that someone like Jasmine Crockett had been allowed to drag Melania's name into it. "She's doing this for attention," he reportedly said, throwing a pen across the resolute desk. "She wants to be famous. I'll make her famous." Melania didn't say much during that meeting. She sat with her arms folded, jaw tight, watching the room talk around her. When asked whether she wanted to issue a statement, she shook her head. "Not yet," she said quietly. "Not until I know what they've seen." That unsettled the room. There was more in the filing than just a simple request. The language about liability and foreign assets struck a nerve. Even a minor misinterpretation could trigger questions about business dealings the Trump family hadn't publicly disclosed. The White House legal team huddled in the Roosevelt Room before lunch. One attorney, a gray-haired senior advisor named Gilbert Parr, looked exhausted as he went over options. "The problem," he told the room, "is that we can't prove intent. If she filed this for protection, and that protection relates to your business, then that could imply she had reason to believe you were legally exposed at the time." Trump scowled. "So she's throwing me under the bus to save her ass." Parr didn't respond. Melania remained in the residence for most of the day. Her personal assistant, Alenka, brought up tea and a stack of printed articles. Melania skimmed through them without expression. The same photo kept popping up, her hand clutching a note card, her eyes slightly wide, her lips parted in mid-stumble. "Do you regret it?" Alenka asked softly, kneeling beside her. Melania didn't answer right away. "I regret that it's public," she said, "but I don't regret protecting myself." Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett sat quietly in a back booth at a cafe in Arlington, sipping coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. She wore a hoodie and jeans, trying to stay under the radar, but it didn't work. A man at the register recognized her. He didn't say anything, just gave her a thumbs up and walked out. She didn't smile. She was thinking about what came next, because she knew the retaliation was already being planned. Sure enough, by that evening, a wave of op-eds hit the internet. Conservative blogs questioned her motives, claiming she was trying to destroy a marriage for political gain. Pundits on TV rolled clips of Jasmine during past committee hearings, calling her aggressive, performative, even dangerous. One anchor smirked and said, maybe she should focus on her district instead of dragging the First Lady into drama. But others pushed back. One editorial from the Los Angeles Times read, Jasmine Crockett didn't expose Melania Trump. She exposed the fear that even women at the top aren't immune from the fallout of unchecked power. In Pittsburgh, a group of college students staged a small rally with signs that read, "Truth matters, even when it's personal." On Instagram, younger voters started clipping Jasmine's speech with the caption, "She said it calmly, but she said it loud. Even still, the White House wasn't done." The next day, a senior advisor leaked an email to the Washington Examiner claiming Jasmine had manipulated sealed documents for political theater. It was a bluff. No law had been broken, but it sparked another round of commentary. Back in her office, Jasmine's press secretary asked if she wanted to respond. "Nope," Jasmine said. "Let them spin. I'm not answering a lie with a headline." But while the headlines screamed back and forth, a quieter story was starting to surface. One Melania had tried to bury years ago. Before the media storm, before the podium misstep, and way before Jasmine ever touched that sealed folder, there was a quiet trail Melania Trump had left behind, not unintentionally. She was careful, obsessively so, but paper always leaves something behind. In early spring of 2021, Melania made 3 discrete trips that never showed up on her official schedule. One to Reno, one to Zurich, and one unannounced detour to Miami, where she met with a retired international finance attorney named Martin Seckler. Her team booked the flights under aliases, kept the lodging modest, and never allowed any press within reach. There were no limousines or public entrances, no handshakes or ribbon cuttings, just one woman moving silently through a world she never fully trusted. The Reno trip was the most important. It's where the paper trail started. The lawyer she met there, Celine Duran, had once worked on international tax litigation for executives in Vegas casinos. She wasn't famous, but she was precise, and she understood the difference between hiding and insulating. Melania told her she wanted to protect herself. Not because of an affair, not because she was planning to leave, but because she was afraid of being held responsible for things I was not part of. That's the phrase Celine remembered most. She even wrote it down. They spoke for nearly 5 hours behind a locked office door inside a strip mall law firm that didn't have a website. Celine later told reporters, after the story broke wide, that Melania seemed scared, but not weak. She wasn't trying to be clever. She was trying to be safe. In Zurich, she spoke with a banker who specialized in discrete asset repositioning. That meeting only lasted 40 minutes, enough to understand how complicated her situation really was. The Trump empire wasn't just a set of buildings and golf courses. It was a web of shell companies, offshore stakes, shared licenses, and silent partners. Many of them with connections Melania wanted nothing to do with. She wasn't a lawyer, but she could read between the lines. The concern wasn't just that she'd be dragged into court one day. It was that her son might. That everything she'd tried to keep clean could be yanked into something much messier. She wasn't naive. She had seen enough during her years at Trump's side to know which battles were hers and which ones could drown her, so she filed the paperwork. Celine drafted it carefully, using language that flagged risk without making accusations. No mention of criminal activity, just concern, caution, and intent to shield. When it was submitted in Nevada, it was sealed within 36 hours, standard protocol for private family documents involving national figures. No one expected it to surface, not even Melania, especially not years later, during a random ethics hearing led by someone she'd never met. But life doesn't wait for your plan to feel safe. Back in the present, as media figures scrambled for context, Jasmine Crockett's staff quietly confirmed the connections. Her lead researcher, Jaden Gwynn, was the one who found the travel dates and matched them to obscure docket entries in the Washoe County system. Jasmine never asked how she did it. "She's just that good," she told a friend during a call that evening. But for Jasmine, this wasn't about scoring points. It was about truth that lived in the shadows. Truth that powerful people assumed would never see light. She thought about all the women she'd met over the years, clients who signed things they didn't understand, who paid for decisions they never made, who stayed quiet because they were told silence was respectable. Melania wasn't like them, not entirely, but in this one way, maybe she was. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't blamed, she'd just tried to protect herself in the only way she could. That mattered. The public didn't know that part of the story yet. All they saw was the press conference clip and a few buzzwords online. But slowly, deeper pieces were emerging. A blog post from an old legal assistant in Reno confirmed Melania's visit. A financial paper out of Zurich hinted at a flagged wire transfer during the same week. Then, a local journalist in Miami published a short piece about a mystery meeting between Melania and a retired attorney with international holdings expertise. None of it was smoking gun material, but taken together, it painted a picture. Melania hadn't been plotting a divorce. She'd been trying to draw a line, and Jasmine Crockett had drawn it in public ink. But the world didn't run on sympathy. It ran on control, and there were still people in Washington determined to wrest that control back. Within hours of Jasmine's unsealing move, political operatives began crafting their counter-narrative. Their first weapon? Doubt. If they couldn't disprove the document's existence, they could at least question how it got out. By mid-morning, conservative outlets were already pushing a phrase that stuck hard and fast: the leak. Fox News ran a chyron that read, "Crockett weaponizes sealed filing. How did she get it?" Talk radio flooded with callers demanding she be investigated. A clip of a commentator named Julian Frey circulated on social media. "This was stolen," he said. "You don't just come across sealed documents unless someone breaks the law." Except Jasmine hadn't broken any law. That part of the story just wasn't as exciting to the people looking to spin it. In a quiet press conference the following afternoon, Jasmine stood behind a row of microphones in front of her district office. She wasn't wearing a suit. She didn't have a teleprompter. Just a manila folder and a calm voice. "I didn't leak anything," she began. "This wasn't a drop from some anonymous source. This was a sealed document tied directly to a pending ethics inquiry regarding undeclared foreign assets." She paused, flipped the folder open, and held up a printed copy of the House Subcommittee Rules. Section 6.4, Legal Disclosure when Documents Intersect with Active Oversight Jurisdiction. I followed procedure. It was unsealed in a live session, on record, under the law. No theatrics, just facts. Still, questions flew in from every direction. Why Melania? Why now? Were you trying to destroy the marriage? Was this coordinated with the Biden White House? She answered the same way each time. "I didn't go looking for this. It came to me while investigating financial disclosures. The document was real and relevant. That's the job I was elected to do." She didn't mention the Reno meetings, or Zurich, or the Miami visit. That part was still off the table. She wanted the public to focus on one thing, that a sitting first lady had taken private legal steps to isolate herself from the financial reach of the presidency. That mattered, but cable news wasn't built for nuance. So while Jasmine clarified the facts, pundits pushed narratives. The words leak, plot, and trap dominated headlines. Meanwhile, inside the White House, officials were struggling to find their footing. They'd hoped to bury the story under noise and confusion, but Jasmine's press conference threw a wrench into that strategy. She hadn't fumbled, she hadn't been vague, and she hadn't blinked when asked about Melania directly. "Did you have personal motivation in choosing to reveal this?" "No," Jasmine replied, "but I do believe when someone, anyone, tries to quietly protect themselves from abuse of power and gets punished for it, that's a problem. And if we don't talk about it, we're complicit." That quote was replayed more than anything else. Supporters praised her for standing firm. Critics said she was weaponizing female solidarity for political gain. One article even accused her of being selectively righteous, calling it convenient that she'd targeted a former model with a foreign accent instead of the real culprit, Donald Trump. That didn't bother Jasmine. She'd seen worse. What did bother her was the silence from the other side of the aisle. Not a single Republican member had reached out to her directly, not to ask questions, not to argue. not even to express concern over the ethical questions raised. Instead, they stayed quiet publicly and schemed privately. An aide in one GOP office leaked a draft of a resolution to censure her. Another circulated a talking points memo suggesting she be investigated for inappropriate handling of sealed legal material. The memo conveniently ignored the rule Jasmine had cited, but again, perception often outweighed truth. That night, Jasmine got a call from a surprising number. Representative Crockett? Yes. This is Meredith Grantham with the St. Louis Sentinel. Off the record, there's someone in the ethics office who's been told not to speak about the filing's chain of custody. They're afraid. They want you to know the heat's coming from higher up than the party. Jasmine paused. How high? They wouldn't say, but they did use the word protective insulation. I've only heard that term once. It was during a probe into foreign money flowing through shell properties owned by the Kushner network. That made Jasmine sit forward. She thanked the reporter and hung up. But as the truth kept surfacing, Jasmine realized the real story wasn't about a post-nup anymore. It was about who wanted to keep the First Lady quiet and why. By Friday morning, the Capitol hallways felt different. People weren't walking. They were marching. Doors stayed closed longer. Whispers got quieter. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a name in the news cycle anymore. She was now part of the strategy sessions, the private memos, the fast-moving damage control efforts on both sides of the aisle. A junior aide to Senator Roland Quayle accidentally left a talking points printout on a printer in the Senate lounge. A cleaning staffer spotted it and snapped a photo. It read, "Do not engage publicly with Crockett. Deflect to process. If asked about First Lady, say, it's personal, not political." They were scared, not of Jasmine herself, but of the doors she'd opened. Across the country, the reactions were volatile. In Sacramento, protesters gathered outside the Capitol Annex, holding signs that read, "Transparency isn't treason." They weren't all Jasmine's supporters. Some had never heard of her until that week, but they were angry. At the silence. At the spin. At the idea that someone in Melania's position had tried to speak quietly through legal channels and was now being called dramatic for it. In Pittsburgh, a different crowd assembled. Conservative, suited, calculated. They spoke into microphones and accused Jasmine of dismantling the sacred privacy of marriage, calling her a weapon of the woke. A pastor with a radio show held up a Bible and claimed the entire scandal was the latest attempt to poison the moral fabric of America. Jasmine's name wasn't just in the news. It was in sermons, op-eds, grocery store checkout conversations. The split was real and getting deeper by the hour. Inside Congress, tensions reached a boiling point during a closed-door ethics subcommittee meeting. A Republican representative from Nebraska, Calvin Dreer, openly accused Jasmine of using the private affairs of a decent First Lady to build her own name. Jasmine didn't blink. "You think protecting yourself is a private affair?" she asked him, arms crossed. "It's not your business," he snapped back. "It's the public's business when the woman sitting next to the most powerful man in the world tries to legally remove herself from his shadow," she replied. "And it's my business when you pretend that's not a red flag." That exchange leaked almost word for word. Reporters quoted it by mid-afternoon. Clips from old hearings began resurfacing. Jasmine grilling CEOs, confronting law enforcement over civil rights violations. They framed her as bold, calculated, divisive. But for a growing number of voters, she was becoming something else. Someone who didn't flinch. Late that evening, Senator Gloria Estabrook, an old guard Democrat who rarely stepped out of line, made a surprise appearance on a local radio show in Wilmington, Delaware. "I wasn't sure about Crockett's tactics at first," she admitted, "but I read the filing. I've seen how the rules were followed. And frankly, if a First Lady felt she had to protect herself from her own husband's money, that's something we should be talking about, not punishing people for revealing it." Her words changed everything. By the next morning, the story had legs again, but this time the tone shifted. Now, it wasn't just about Jasmine. It was about the document, about why Melania filed it, about what she knew and what she feared, about the pattern. In a panel on MSNBC, legal experts began connecting dots. An ethics lawyer from Georgetown pointed out how Melania's legal language mirrored past cases involving foreign asset exposure and liability insulation. A former Treasury analyst quietly confirmed that the phrase protective repositioning had shown up before in cases where spouses of public officials had reason to believe they were being used as buffers for financial schemes. In short, Melania hadn't been paranoid. She'd been strategic. And Jasmine hadn't blindsided the country. She'd forced it to look at something it had ignored. That weekend, Jasmine finally accepted one interview request, from a small independent news podcast based in Minneapolis. When asked why she chose that outlet over CNN or the Washington Post, she answered simply, "They've been covering corruption and asset evasion for years, way before anyone cared what I had to say." The host asked if she was afraid of what might come next. "Sure," Jasmine said, "but I'm more afraid of what happens when we stop calling things what they are." But while Jasmine began reclaiming the narrative, the silence from Melania was starting to fracture, and the world was about to hear from her directly. The announcement came quietly, no press release, no White House memo, just a brief teaser posted online by journalist Alyssa Chen from PBS NewsHour. The interview had already been filmed, taped in a private residence in Arlington, far from the cameras and chaos of Pennsylvania Avenue. First Lady Melania Trump speaks exclusively about the 2021 post-nuptial filing, the teaser read. A still image showed her sitting on a cream-colored couch, hands folded in her lap, eyes steady. No makeup artist, no presidential seal behind her. Just a lamp, a window, and silence. The full interview dropped at 7 p.m. sharp. People watched in silence, some expecting denial, others expecting a veiled counterattack. What they got was something else entirely. Melania began by acknowledging the document. "Yes," she said, "I filed the petition, and yes, I did it while my husband was still in office." Her accent was clear, her tone firm. She didn't read from notes. "I was advised by counsel to take steps to legally separate my personal assets from those connected to foreign properties and offshore investments," she continued, "not because I feared him, but because I feared the system we were standing in." She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask for sympathy. Instead, she spoke about vulnerability, about being a public figure who, despite the privileges, still felt trapped in the machinery of power. There were accounts I had never heard of, properties I had never seen, transactions I was asked to sign for without explanation. I'm not a lawyer. I was a wife who didn't want her name tied to anything she didn't understand. Then came the part no one expected. Melania admitted she had watched Jasmine Crockett's committee reading live. Her phone buzzed during the briefing, and her aide showed her the clip as she sat off to the side. "I was shocked," she said, "but not angry." The interviewer, caught off guard, asked her to explain. "I always believed someone would find it one day, and I always hoped that, if they did, they would understand what I was trying to do." She did. That moment hit like a punch across political lines. Supporters of Jasmine posted the clip within seconds. Even critics paused. Melania went on to describe how isolated she had felt in 2021, how she'd reached out to attorneys without telling most of her husband's inner circle, how she'd asked for privacy, not because of shame, but out of fear of how the media and the party would weaponize her decision. "I wasn't trying to leave him," she said. "I was trying to leave behind the parts of the presidency I never asked for." The interview lasted only 19 minutes, but it reshaped the entire conversation. Suddenly, it wasn't about scandal. It was about survival. It wasn't about politics. It was about protection. In that brief sit-down, Melania gave Jasmine something priceless. Confirmation. Not an alliance, not a headline, just the quiet truth that what Jasmine had exposed wasn't fiction or speculation. It was a choice. A woman trying to keep her world intact before it fractured beyond repair. That night, social media boiled over. She did understand trended worldwide. Cable panels scrambled to change their tone. Conservative pundits who had spent days slamming Jasmine tried to pivot. "Maybe she stumbled on something worth discussing," one of them admitted sheepishly on live air. "Maybe we owe her more credit than we gave." Jasmine didn't release a statement. She didn't take a victory lap. She simply posted a single sentence on her account. "Sometimes telling the truth means walking alone until someone else finds the courage to speak." Melania's team confirmed that no future statements would follow. No interviews, no elaboration. It was one and done. And somehow, that made it hit harder. In the weeks that followed, women from across the country began sharing their own stories. Not about politics or power, but about quietly protecting themselves, legally separating finances, asking for clarity before signing. The conversation had shifted, but as the country began to listen more closely, the ones who had tried to silence Jasmine started facing pressure of their own, and they weren't going to take it quietly. Once Melania's interview aired, the tone across Capitol Hill changed overnight. Not publicly at first, but in subtle ways. Lawmakers who had spent the past week either dodging questions or criticizing Jasmine Crockett suddenly went quiet. Press secretaries stopped issuing statements. Congressional aides began requesting off-the-record meetings, something had shifted. Behind the scenes, there was a scramble, not to stop the story, but to figure out how to navigate the mess it left behind. By Tuesday morning, Jasmine's inbox was flooded again, not just with support from constituents and advocacy groups, but with invitations. Invitations from lawmakers who had avoided her in the halls just days ago. A few even asked her team if they could schedule time just to understand her process. One of the most surprising emails came from Senator Wes Hollow, a centrist from Ohio who had previously dismissed Jasmine as performative. He requested a private meeting. "I underestimated what you were getting at," he admitted once they sat down. "You didn't just reveal a marriage move. You revealed the fear sitting underneath all this power." Jasmine nodded, but didn't take the compliment. "Fear's been here. We've just been trained not to name it." Elsewhere, Trump's legal team tried to contain the damage. A statement released through a family attorney downplayed Melania's comments, claiming they were personal reflections, not legal admissions, and accused the press of twisting her words, but it was too late. The story had outgrown the spin. Meanwhile, Jasmine's appearance on 60 Minutes had been scheduled. Not because she asked, but because producers couldn't ignore the flood of viewer requests demanding they speak to her. Sitting across from veteran journalist Paige Brannon, Jasmine didn't hold back. "The truth is, Melania didn't try to start a political fire," she said. "She tried to quietly separate herself from liabilities that weren't hers. She acted with more clarity than a lot of elected officials I've seen." Brannon leaned in. "Do you think she feared criminal consequences?" "I think she feared getting caught in something she didn't cause," Jasmine replied, "and that fear should have been a red flag for everyone watching her back then." Clips from the interview went viral, but more importantly, they reached the exact people Jasmine had hoped would listen. Civic education groups started developing materials around the topic of legal independence inside marriages, particularly high-profile ones. University ethics departments hosted open forums. One podcast episode titled "The Post-Nup That Changed Politics" racked up over 6 million downloads in 4 days. And then came something Jasmine hadn't expected, a handwritten letter. No envelope, just her name and office address, written in careful cursive on the back of a folded piece of printer paper. Inside, it read, "I watched, I listened, and I cried. You didn't just see her, you saw us, all of us who did the right thing quietly and still got accused of betrayal. Thank you. No name given." She read it twice, then tucked it into a drawer in her desk, beside a photo of her late aunt, the one who'd marched for voting rights decades earlier. For the first time in a long while, Jasmine wasn't fighting for attention. She was fighting with clarity, and people were beginning to follow. But not everyone. Inside certain committee circles, whispers turned into whispers with weight. There was talk of using the House Ethics Board to probe whether Jasmine had weaponized procedural rules to force the unsealing. The argument was thin, but politics didn't require evidence, just noise. Backdoor meetings ramped up. Some strategists floated the idea of pushing a reprimand resolution to stain Jasmine's record, just enough to cloud her rising public support. An anonymous source from inside one of those meetings confirmed to a journalist, "The goal isn't to remove her, it's to remind her she's not untouchable." Jasmine expected it. What she didn't expect was who stepped in front of it. Representative Corinne Dale, a Republican from Kansas with a long history of quiet moderation, issued a public statement defending Jasmine's right to bring forward documents during oversight, if they were relevant and legal. "Discomfort," Dale wrote, "isn't the same as impropriety. Crockett followed the rules. If we start punishing people for that, we're not preserving ethics, we're neutering them." It stunned the House. Jasmine read the quote aloud to her staff and smiled for the first time in a week. But the moment wasn't about vindication. It was about the space that honesty had carved and what came next for the people still too afraid to speak. 2 weeks after the story broke, the frenzy had begun to fade. The headlines moved on. Political panels returned to their usual sparring. The world, as always, kept turning. But something about the tone had changed. And Jasmine Crockett knew it. She felt it most in the quiet moments, riding the elevator alone in the Cannon House office building, sitting at her desk before anyone else arrived, passing security guards who offered a subtle nod instead of small talk. There was a different kind of weight in the air now. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Not everyone agreed with what she'd done. That was never the goal. But even the ones who opposed her had stopped pretending she didn't belong at the table. What Jasmine had done wasn't just shine a light on a document. It was shine a light on the system that expected silence from people like Melania and punishment for people like her. She hadn't leaked. She hadn't grandstanded. She'd followed the rules. And still, she'd been called reckless, theatrical, dangerous. But the moment Melania spoke, the story turned. Because it wasn't about politics anymore. It was about self-preservation. About the impossible space women were expected to live in. Loyal but aware. Present but not involved. Supportive but never questioning. And Jasmine had called it out. In the days that followed, more voices came forward, some loud, some barely whispers. A former White House aide anonymously emailed Jasmine's office, thanking her for not making us feel like we imagined it. A retired judge from Oregon wrote a letter recalling a case where a political wife was left holding a $1.2 million debt after her husband's quiet fraud conviction. She didn't see it coming, the judge wrote, because she was told not to ask. Even in high school civics classrooms, teachers began using the incident as a case study in government accountability. A clip of Jasmine reading the unsealed document was shown during a mock ethics debate in Santa Fe, where a student stood up and said, "I didn't know you could be brave like that in real life." But Jasmine didn't feel brave. Not really. She felt tired of being the one to speak up. Tired of being asked if she was sure, tired of needing confirmation from someone else, someone like Melania, just to be taken seriously. Still, she wouldn't change a thing. The incident didn't just give her political clout, it gave her clarity. Clarity about the job she signed up for. Clarity about the pressure women face when their private instincts clash with public roles. Clarity about the importance of showing up, even when you're afraid of being the only one in the room who sees what's right in front of you. When asked later during an ethics forum what advice she'd give to young leaders, she paused before answering. "Don't wait for a scandal to do your job," she said, "and don't wait for permission to protect people who haven't been heard. Sometimes truth is quiet. Sometimes it's legalese in a dry file no one reads, but it still matters." The audience applauded, but Jasmine didn't smile. She just looked down at her notes, then back up. Because the truth was, there would be another story like this. Another woman caught in something she didn't cause. Another leader accused of doing too much. Another moment where someone had to decide whether to speak or stay comfortable. Jasmine had made her choice, and whether or not people liked her for it, they remembered it. That was enough. At least for now. If you're watching this and wondering whether you'd have spoken up, ask yourself this. Are you waiting for the moment, or are you willing to be the moment? And if this story made you think, share it. Talk about it. And don't forget to subscribe. Stories like this don't disappear, but people do. Stay loud, stay sharp, and we'll see you next time.